Welcome to this training created by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and Dartmouth's Geisel School of Medicine. Today's training topic is routes of exposure to environmental chemicals. My name is Megan Romano, and I'm an Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the Geisel School of Medicine. My primary areas of expertise are environmental health and perinatal epidemiology. I'm excited to share with you today this approximately 10-minute training on routes of exposure to environmental chemicals. After completing today's training, you should be able to define an exposure, identify types of exposure, name 3 primary routes of exposure, distinguish between chronic and acute exposures, describe the dimensions of exposure, and identify vulnerable populations. For purposes of our training today, we will start by answering the question, what is an exposure? At the broadest level, an exposure typically represents the interaction of behavior and environment. As we are thinking about environmental exposures today, this encompasses all the chemicals and compounds we come into contact with during our daily lives. Most of us will encounter hundreds or even thousands of these environmental exposures each day. There are many different types of exposures, and these may be naturally occurring or human-made. Biological exposures include things like microbes and viruses. Chemical or nutrient exposures may be organic, such as carbohydrates, fats, proteins, or certain chemicals that include carbon-hydrogen bonds, or inorganic, such as heavy metals. It is important to note that both organic and inorganic chemicals may be either toxic or non-toxic, depending on their properties. Physical exposures are things like ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, while an example of mechanical exposure is injury. Psychosocial factors, such as stress and genetic factors, can also be considered as exposures. Today, we will primarily focus on environmental exposures, but it is useful to consider these in the broader context of potential exposures that we may encounter during our lives. When thinking about an individual's exposure to contaminants in the environment, we need to consider all possible routes of exposure. The 3 primary routes of exposure are inhalation, what we breathe in, ingestion, what we eat or drink, and skin or eye contact. We may inhale contaminants from indoor or outdoor air. When showering, some types of contamination in our water can become airborne, also leading to exposure through inhalation. We may ingest contaminants when they are present in the food that we eat and water or beverages we drink. Finally, our skin and eyes may absorb certain contaminants. For example, when we are bathing or swimming, or as we handle certain materials. When you are bathing or swimming, you may also accidentally swallow small amounts of water, and this incidental ingestion is another pathway for exposure. Your total exposure is the combination of all contaminants absorbed through inhalation, ingestion, and skin or eye contact combined. This varies between individuals and across communities. If one person drinks 1 cup of coffee every day for 30 days, and another drinks 30 cups of coffee today, which person are you worried about? Exposures to a small amount of coffee for a prolonged period of time can be described as a chronic exposure, whereas ingestion of a large amount of coffee in a short time period is an acute exposure. Note that both chronic and acute exposure to coffee will have health effects, but in this example, acute coffee exposure is more likely to result in immediate adverse health consequences. Long-term chronic exposure to coffee may contribute to anxiety or insomnia, though these effects may be less noticeable and may take a long time to develop. For other exposures, like exposure to environmental toxicants, we may see adverse health effects with both low levels of chronic exposure, such as increased risk of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, or with acute or short-term exposures to high amounts, such as an arsenic poisoning, which will result in vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and potentially even death. Understanding whether an exposure is chronic or acute can help public health professionals anticipate the types of health outcomes that may occur following exposure. Understanding all of the dimensions of exposure can further help to clarify the expected effects of an exposure. We consider duration, intensity, and frequency of exposure by asking 3 questions. First, how long? Second, how much? And third, how often? As introduced on the last slide, acute versus chronic exposure helps us to appreciate the duration of exposure. Cumulative or additive exposure, or peak or maximum exposure, are incorporated into the dimension of intensity, reflecting the concentration or quantity of the exposure. For frequency, we consider whether an exposure occurs daily, monthly, or rarely across a person's lifetime. Note also that some exposures will remain stable over time, across the course of our lives. For example, our genes do not change over time. They remain stable from the time we are born until the time that we die. Other exposures will change with time. For example, we probably have varying levels of physical activity over our life, possibly being very active in childhood and less active as we age. Both exposures that are stable and exposures that change have the potential to influence our health in either positive or negative ways. In public health, we frequently consider vulnerable populations. Broadly speaking, these groups include individuals who are pregnant, children, elderly, underinsured, socioeconomically disadvantaged, from underrepresented racial or ethnic minorities, those with certain medical conditions, or individuals that share other characteristics that make them more susceptible to illness or more likely to experience severe health outcomes. During different life stages, individuals may be more susceptible to the potential toxic effects of environmental exposures. For example, pregnant people and the developing fetus may be more sensitive to the effects of environmental exposures than healthy adults. Likewise, children, particularly infants, interact with the environment in different ways than adults. This may include crawling and playing on the ground, or placing their hands or toys into their mouths. Likewise, infants and children have a small body size and may not yet possess all of the protective mechanisms in the body that are present for healthy adults. We also consider that individuals may be more sensitive to environmental exposures as they age. In this way, it is important that we consider whether children or elderly individuals may be more vulnerable to environmental exposures than adults. We also consider that other characteristics may make certain groups of people more sensitive to environmental exposures or put them at higher risk of experiencing exposure. This may be complicated by other factors that make them more likely to experience illness or have more severe symptoms following exposure. Such groups might include immunocompromised individuals or economically vulnerable communities. Members of vulnerable populations are sometimes provided with special protections in health research and health policy. For example, fish consumption advisories may be issued for the general public, but may include specific provisions for pregnant people, nursing parents, children, or elderly individuals. To summarize our topic for today, you have learned to define an exposure, Identify types of exposure. Name 3 primary routes of exposure. Distinguish between chronic and acute exposures. Describe the dimensions of exposure, and identify vulnerable populations. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with us today. I want to express my gratitude to everyone that worked on this training, but especially to Karen Craver and Jonathan Patali. If you'd like to learn more, I'd encourage you to check out our accompanying fact sheets and additional trainings available at the link below.